Welcome to our first online lecture for our Women's Studies English 2393 Honors section, Intro to Women and Literature. As you know by now, we are launched off into our special subject of the semester, which is the heroine in young adult fiction. And particularly, we're going to be focusing on American writers and one Canadian writer, and we're going to be looking, really, well, we could call it North American fiction then, couldn't we? And we're going to be looking at novels and films, both. But picking up where I left off in our first class discussion or two, talking about sort of the background for Charlotte Temple and the novel, what we're going to do is I'm going to provide a little bit of background on some important differences between those eras, the 18th and 19th century, and ours when it comes to gender, marriage, and these sorts of things. So we're going to be looking at the institution of marriage, the division of labor within marriages. Most people don't think of it that way. We think of it usually as traditional male or female roles or stereotypical ones. But there was a division of labor, is one way to look at it. Women's educational opportunities, sex and childbirth, and women and the literary marketplace. Because all of these things are going to be topics that we'll bring up again and again, sort of to lay some context there for us as we're exploring the different novels and films that we have on our list this time. Okay? So let's start in with a discussion of marriage in the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, you could do whole classes and whole books have been written on this subject, so I really only have the opportunity to kind of hit some highlights of things that I want you to bear in mind, all right? I'm not trying to give a lecture on marriage in the 18th and 19th century, just things that would help inform our future discussions of novels and films that we have on tap. A lot of things depended on one's social class, as I raised in our class the other day. But regardless, people 100 to 200 years ago certainly viewed marriage very differently. First of all, most weddings were not elaborate or even religious affairs. Most people 100 or 200 years ago or even longer didn't even get married in churches. People don't realize this. Today we get married in churches. We spend ridiculous amounts of money. We even have television shows called Say Yes to the Dress and The Bachelor and all these things. The proposals have to be elaborate. People really didn't do that 100 years ago or 200 years ago. They didn't do that 75 or 80 years ago. Church weddings are really, as a big popular thing, really only started in the 20th century, to be honest with you. And in fact, proposals weren't really all that formal. Certainly nobody did like skywriting or proposing from, skydiving or, stadium jumbotron type of proposals. This would be considered bizarre and even silly. Well, they didn't spend an awful lot of money on it. Traditional working class people, or certainly even middle class people, largely got married in their parlors, in their living rooms. Or if it was a fairly big affair, they would do it out in the backyard or in the front area outside or something of that nature. Frequently, it was a civil affair. It was seen as a civil affair. It was done by a judge. In many cases, many more cases. In fact, one of the things people don't realize, they think of Puritans and Pilgrims and things like that back in the 1600s as being very religious people, and certainly they were. But the Pilgrims and the Puritans largely saw marriage as kind of a civil contract. They didn't really see it as a marriage, as a religious thing. Obviously, in all matters, you kept your word. Your word was your bond, and contracts and business arrangements should be honored. And, of course, this was a covenant that was described in the Bible, so it wasn't as though it didn't have religious implications. They just didn't see it as being a religious ceremony. It was a civil ceremony to Puritans that had religious authority and religious backing to it. So, the idea that we do these things in churches and we do them very elaborately and we invite hundreds of people and we spend thousands and thousands of dollars and we spend gobs of money on rings and dresses and chocolate, fountains and just bizarre. This is just something that would never have been done. A typical middle-class family, not a poor family, middle-class family, the woman would have had a dress that was made by herself or others that she knew. Most of them would pitch in. They would have a dinner and a cake that were made by the local women in the town. They would not have ordered a cake. They would not have catered anything. They would have just done potluck. They would have had the local minister come over, perform the ceremony either in the living room or in the backyard, and then they would have had a very nice party with probably some music and some celebration. But frequently, it wasn't done at all. You just had a few people there. You just said your vows, and that was that. And you didn't have anything really elaborate beyond that. It just was not something that was done. Now, marriage was also considered in the 18th and 19th century inviolable and for the most part irrevocable, meaning there were very few grounds for divorce, and even if you had good just cause for divorce, you didn't generally do it. There were a lot of people who suffered through a lot of really bad marriages to some really awful people, both men and women, who had really great grounds for divorce and simply didn't do it. This is something that you probably know, but it's a thing that we want to keep in context. That doesn't mean that we didn't have that we didn't have our ancestors didn't have wonderful traditions like jumping the broom. African American families frequently kept that tradition from Africa itself, and exchanging of rings and vows and things like this. But we would have. Our ancestors would have been somewhat repulsed by, or we would be repulsed, I should say, by the practical view of marriage held by the affluent or middle classes. We tend to think that you should marry for love and that money and all these practical considerations should come secondary. That you shouldn't marry just because you share religious views, that you shouldn't marry just because you want children, you shouldn't marry just because you need money. And I don't think that our ancestors, especially the middle or the affluent classes, would have thought that those were the only bases for getting married, but they thought they were pretty darn important, more so than we would have. We are really the products of the late Victorian era, where marriages became somewhat romanticized and spiritualized. It sounds weird for me to say marriages became romanticized, because we so equate marriage with love and not with practical aspects of human life, that to even think of marriages without romance is just anathema to us. We would never even consider that. We would say, what do you mean marriages that are, what do you mean we romanticize marriage? Of course marriages should be romanticized. Because we see that as the norm. They did not see that necessarily as the most important or driving factor in marriage. Marriage was important for stability, for procreation, for family, for future, to thrive, material prosperity, social standing, religious injunction, all those kinds of things. It was the late Victorians, and I'm talking here 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, where people really began to romanticize marriage, where the attitude started to shift towards the idea that the main reason you should marry is for love, and that all the other considerations were important, but that was the main thing, right? We see the inkling of that in Charlotte Temple, don't we? Where at least there's a lot of pushback on the part of Susanna Rosen and Charlotte Temple and some of the younger characters against their parents' view that marriage should be all about practicality. But there is no rejection. There is no rejection in Rosen's novel of a practical view of marriage. There isn't. She constantly talks about prudence, doesn't she? And prudence means, look, it doesn't mean just only being practical, but it does mean that there's a level of an element of practicality that should inform your relationships. So we tend to go probably to an extreme that our ancestors would be very uncomfortable with. They would say, well, this is really weird. I mean, come on, don't you realize that, moon and spoon and June and, all the heavy, breathing and all this kind of stuff that gets you all worked up. Don't you realize that that's going to fade in time, right? So we ought to be looking for is compatibility and mutual values and those kinds of things. The late Victorians also tended to spiritualize love. The notion that your soulmate, right? This soulmate idea would have been very foreign to early Victorians, or certainly in the 18th century. What do you mean your soulmate? You're way over investing this relationship. It should have a practical function. You should get along. You need to make a good, smart choice. But it was a little bit more intellectual than it was spiritual as a decision for most of our ancestors. And that was true regardless of race or class for the most part. I will say the exception to that is probably the working classes, who tended largely to marry because they were simply attracted to each other or liked each other or enjoyed each other's company. And the reason that they didn't have a more practical view of it was because they just didn't have any property, right? So there was nothing to be practical about. They didn't own anything. They were just laborers, and so they married whomever they wish. In the United States, African Americans who were enslaved, and not all were, okay, but those who were enslaved, they had a lot of restrictions and limitations on their ability to marry, obviously. Even, believe it or not, up to and including marriage vows for African Americans that read, not till death do us part, but until death or distance do we part. And the distance is a reminder that at any time one of the married partners could actually be sold, and that did happen. There were a lot of people who were in relationships that weren't allowed to continue, even though they may have been very much in love. So when we talk about marriage in the 18th and 19th century, there's a lot to talk about. But I just want to kind of set the stage a bit, because we're going to be reading some older texts, and we're going to be then coming into the 20th century, and I want you to have an understanding or appreciation, do a little thinking about how different our era is. And we don't even question it. We just think that this is normal, but it hasn't always been normal the way we look at it. Okay. By the way, that book over there, Leap Year Manual, How to Get a Husband, I have no ability to tell you how good it is or not. Can't tell you. Maybe it got a lot of people husbands. Who knows? Now, to talk about the domestic division of labor, very important to talk about too. And again, this is probably just common sense. You know a lot about all this already. I'm just trying to place it in some context for you. That's what the purpose of this lecture is, and try to get you to bear some things in mind as you're reading. Traditional roles and why they changed in the 20th century. I mean, it was hard living back in the 18th and 19th centuries. It was hard work if you were a laboring person. Even if you weren't, it was still very, very hard. The men did a lot of physical, exhausting labor. The women did as well. And the child rearing and the cooking and the laundry was just, I just would challenge you just for a weekend to try to do things the way your great-great-grandmother did in terms of just doing laundry. In fact, laundry was the most dreaded of all household chores. Almost everyone did it on Monday, and they called it Blue Monday because of that, because it was laundry day. And women hated it. It was just physically draining and exhausting. The amount of labor that went into doing laundry was something else. You had to do cooking on the weekend, store the food up because you would not have any time to make meals during the day on Monday if you did laundry. It was a day-long affair. In fact, the first modern household appliance that was ever invented and that ever sold in large quantities was the washing machine, because it was so intense, the labor was. The getting the water, pouring the water, putting the soap in, soaking the clothes, scrubbing them, wringing them, rinsing them, hanging them out to dry, folding them up. It was amazing, the amount of work. I mean, if you were a woman, you did that kind of work, you had some real biceps and triceps on you, let me tell you, because it was a lot of heavy clothing. And these people wore a lot of clothing, and they got it really, really dirty. Look at the guys down there with the coal mine. Can you imagine being the wife of a coal miner? Can you imagine being the coal miner and how exhausted after a 12-hour day of back-breaking work, muscle-breaking and muscle-straining work? But his wife had to clean that stuff. Unbelievable what they had to do. The level of work. Preparing a meal. Everything from butchering the animal to cleaning the animal, preparing it, hauling the wood in for the wood-burning stove that you cooked on. Hauling water, peeling and preparing foods and seasoning the foods and preserving the foods. It's just a massive amount of work. So this division of labor, which had happened since the beginning of time, was essentially that women worked in the home and men worked outside the home. Not always, but I mean, I'm generalizing, obviously. But it was a necessity, because essentially, let's put it this way, men just would never have been able to do the housework and do the incredible amounts of work that were required of them. Women would never have been able to go out and work for a living and do the incredible amounts of housework that would have been required to feed kids. Today, we have so many modern conveniences. Today, we have so much technology that a woman or a man can do both, and it's relatively easy to do. I mean, I say that, and people say, well, you don't know how hard single moms work. Yes, I do. But given what women used to do 150 years ago, we have it really easy. Men and women have it much, much easier. There's just no way that you could have done sort of the single mom kind of thing without just killing yourself. It just would have been impossible almost. So one reason why people married was the practical need for a spouse. You just simply couldn't support yourself and do all the things that you needed to care for yourself and certainly your children without another partner. It was not at all uncommon up to like 70 years ago or so. When a woman had her husband died, she got remarried really quickly if she could. And the same with a man. If his wife died, he had to have someone take care of those children. You might say, gosh, that's not a great reason to get married. I mean, you know, they should be in love. I know, but the fact is that survival is what we're talking about. Now, suffrage obviously changed a lot of that. The Industrial Revolution changed a lot of that. Ultimately, more and more conveniences, more and more technology, more and more industrial things enter the domestic sphere, liberate a lot of women in a lot of ways for them to be able to not have to do the heavy manual labor inside the home like their mothers had to do. Similarly, as they had more time, they sought more opportunities for education and more opportunities in the workplace, and of course, the vote. One of the really big things that happened, and not enough attention is paid to this, is that during World War II, I should say, so many women were called upon to enter the workforce who had never been in the workforce before. They had been full-time moms. But all these men going over to the war in Europe and in Japan, they had to have, there you see Rosie the Riveter over there, we can do it. They had to have women work in factories and do heavy industrial sorts of work as much as they could. And some women were certainly capable of doing that. Some women found that incredibly challenging and very difficult depending on the job. Just depends on how you're built and what your fitness level is, you know. But the fact of the matter is they gave it everything they had because they had to. They had to win the war. And what happened as a result of that, and a lot of scholars and historians have looked at this, it's very interesting. That generation of women who went from housewife to factory worker during the war and then back to housewife, because their husbands came back and they gave those jobs up to men who needed that work to support their families. And they then, many of them wanted to go back to becoming traditional homemakers. Others, however, liked the fact that they had a paycheck, liked the fact that they earned their own money. They enjoyed that. They got a sense of accomplishment out of it and kind of wished that they could do some more of that. Some did. Some went on to some other careers and were moms. But the fact of the matter is that in the 1940s and 50s and early 60s, there was still a large percentage of women who were professional full-time homemakers, which is in itself a job, believe me, right? My wife is one. And it's a lot of work. But there were a lot more women also gradually over time who said, you know what? I really enjoyed that. And when I have a daughter, I want to make sure that she has an opportunity to pursue a profession if that's what she wants. I want her to have an opportunity to get a paycheck if that's what she wants. So it really wasn't as much the women who worked, the Rosie the Riveters, as who flooded the workplace and stayed there and kind of brought equality of opportunity to the workforce. It was really the Rosie the Riveters' daughters, because the Rosie the Riveters decided that they were going to raise their daughters to give them opportunities. So a lot has changed since then. Do not underestimate technology, modern conveniences, the suffrage movement, and that big shift that happened during World War II that gave a generation of women a taste of what it was like to get into the workforce and earn a paycheck. And a lot of them liked it. And a lot of them, even if they didn't continue to do that themselves, they wanted that opportunity for their daughter. So what we see in the 20th century is not so much a division of labor anymore, but a sort of blurring of those lines. And now we have men who have domestic skills and women who have work skills and vice versa and all of that sort of thing. Next, we want to talk about women and education and the case of someone like Margaret Fuller, who's in the bottom right-hand corner there. In the 19th century, women had almost, I'm not going to say no opportunities for education, but for the most part, they were given relatively, early in the century, relatively superficial opportunities for education. That's true in the 18th century too. They were mostly going to things like finishing schools, where you would learn music and artwork and maybe a foreign language like Italian or French and dance classes and things like that. But certainly not practical skills. Certainly not heavy-duty academic, scientific sorts of inquiries. Margaret Fuller was a big exception. Her father educated her. She's from Boston. She was one of the transcendentalists, knew Ralph Waldo Emerson and all that crew, and educated her in the early 1820s and 30s, well beyond not just women, but most men, certainly. And she was probably one of the best educated people, much less certainly women, in the Western Hemisphere. There's no question. She wrote Women in the 19th Century, and she wrote a great deal about women and education. And unfortunately for her, she found a niche for herself as a writer, certainly, and a thinker and a lecturer. But it was very difficult for her because she was kind of an odd duck. She stuck out, and it was not something that was the norm for women, and it certainly wasn't going to be the norm for some time. What you do see, though, is gradually in the middle of the 19th century, and particularly just before the Civil War, the creation of a number of women's colleges and what were called seminaries. Many of them are actually 2-year and 4-year schools today. Southern Seminary in Virginia, the Seven Sisters schools, Wellesley, Agnes Scott, and all of the other schools up in the Northeast. So the rise of women's colleges and seminaries were largely 2-year schools, okay? And some of them, in fact, in Virginia, so many of them were located up in the Shenandoah Valley, up in the mountains up there. And the reason was because they would send their daughters up there because they thought the air was really bad at certain times of the year down near the coast. And so it was fresh air, and it would keep them from getting malaria or whatever if they sent them up there, and give them an education. Now, if you were an upper class woman, and most of the women who went to these colleges and seminaries in the 19th century were absolutely upper class women, the purpose was for you to gain enough of an education for you to hold a respectable position of your class. You were going to end up marrying a man who was probably well educated, who was going to be an important person in business, in industry, in law, in medicine, and you needed to be up to the part. You were going to entertain and interact with individuals who were educated, so you needed to get an education largely because you had a social position to fill, not for any practical purpose. But that really changes in the late 19th century. And here's the cool thing. Our school, and that's Old Main up at the top there. I don't know who the ladies are. They're not TW students. I just picked that just to show you what was going on in the 50s, okay? Our school is one of the very first schools that focused on practical education for women. The original name of TW was the College of Industrial Arts. Actually, it was kind of like called the Girls' School for something, but the first real name for it was the College of Industrial Arts, which oddly enough is CIA, which is weird, but it was founded to provide specifically, it said in the charter, to provide the same practical educational opportunities that we were providing to young men in agriculture and other areas. And the specific reference here was to Texas A&M. It was to be a female counterpart to Texas A&M, a practical, hands-on, not philosophy, not religion, not art, but originally, practical skills kinds of things, and mostly for middle class or even working class girls. By the way, that down in the bottom there, that's our, I don't know who the ladies are sitting on the rail. I just thought it was kind of cool. It was a cool picture, and it shows also that this was true both for although there was segregation, this was true, this growth in women's colleges was true for both schools that were traditionally white and historically black. This was going on at the same time. It's just that we sometimes have neglected the history or talking about the history of traditionally black colleges. But they were going through the same sort of thing. There was a rise of women's black colleges for women. There was a rise of in the late 19th century, early 20th century, just like with TW, which at that time was all white. There were women's colleges, black colleges that were focusing on vocational and practical skills kinds of things as well. So you just don't read about some of the more neglected parts of history. That's changing a lot these days. So people are a lot more aware of that, and so we're recovering a lot of our history in that regard. But one of the things that also, what I was going to say is down in the bottom left, that's actually the TW 1913 basketball team. Believe it or not, that's 104 years ago. That was our basketball team, and maybe they were great. Maybe they won state champion. I don't know. The co-education movement of the 1950s and 60s. Again, the daughters of these Rosie the Riveters. That's when you get this big thing called the co-education movement in colleges and universities, where women are beginning in much, much larger numbers to want to get a college education. Sometimes they chose traditional roles and traditional vocations like teaching and nursing and librarians and things like this. But a lot of the times they were branching out into law and into medicine. It was harder for them, but it was something that they were very adamant about doing. And so, you should see this. I mean, early 19th century, Margaret Fullers of the world were an incredible rarity. And in fact, in many ways, lived a kind of an isolated and sometimes unhappy life because of that. The rise of women's colleges and seminaries during the 19th century, but mostly for upper class women and for social purposes. Then the introduction of practical education for women, and our school is one great example of that. We were probably a leader in that with respect to opening up opportunity to working class and middle class people. And then you get the co-education movement of the 50s and 60s, where women were enrolling in every single university that they could get into and going into as many different professions as possible. Sex and childbirth. Okay, this is the part where you're all like, oh gosh, is this going to be embarrassing or is it going to be fascinating? Well, we'll see. I want to start off with a few things that you might be surprised about. Many middle class educated women were a lot more sophisticated than you might think. We tend to think of, in the 18th and 19th century, nobody knew anything about sex. Well, that's nonsense. Where do you think little Victorians came from? Of course they knew about sex, and you would think so. However, there were many more who were more naive than you would imagine. So, there's a wonderful book that came out many years ago at Oxford University Press called Secrets of the Heart, where the scholar, decided to look at just typical middle-class women's, letters and diaries, and said, well, we hear that Victorians are really hung up on sex, and we're really like, oh, no, don't talk about it. But how did private correspondence for just average ordinary people view things? Well, it was a shocking and amazing range of things. There were a lot of women who were very comfortable with it, and just it was a fact of life, and they had wonderful relationships with their spouses, and they were very fulfilled. There were a lot of women who did not have that. The woman up in the upper right-hand corner's name is Annie Besant. She was a British early feminist. And she was a real big staunch advocate for sex education, partly because when she got married, as she writes in her autobiography, she had, quote, no more knowledge of the wedding act than if she were a 3-year-old. As in, on her wedding night, no one prepared her for what she was about to experience, like nothing. That could be a bit of a shocker. She was an upper-class woman, highly educated, and knew nothing. On the other hand, there were plenty of middle-class and upper-middle-class women who had an incredible amount of knowledge and had a very fulfilling, intimate life with their husbands. A lot of what was dominant in the 18th and 19th century regarding marriage, sex, childbirth was the religious and societal duty regarding childbirth. Marriage was still seen as the primary vehicle for having children, that it was a duty, that it was a religious obligation, and this was very, very important. And of course, believe it or not, the financial necessity of having children. We think of children as being very expensive today, and they are. Believe me, I got one, and it's breaking my bank account every day because she's a teenager now. But your children were your Social Security. They were your retirement plan. If you grew up and you had 6 or 7 or 8 children, chances are some of them were going to be having the means to be able to care for you when you got old. That was very important. That's still true in many countries around the world. On the other hand, there were a lot of risks involved in sex. The ladies over on the right-hand side there are professionals, shall we say, actual authentic professionals. And over on the left-hand side, there's some shenanigans going on. If you didn't think Grandma and Grandpa, got busy, well, you're wrong, because they did. Because if they didn't, you wouldn't be here, right? And then sadly, on the bottom, one of the terrible risks was death. That's actually a portrait of a woman and a child, both who died in childbirth. And there were terrible risks in having children. In that Secrets of the Heart text I told you about, there is a very moving and heartbreaking letter from a woman who writes to her husband and says, look, I love you. I enjoy our intimate relationships, our intimate encounters all the time, but we just can't do this anymore. Or we have to be much more careful because I'm scared to death of dying in childbirth because the last child she had, she nearly died. That's not a thing that we really worry about now. And it's something our ancestors did worry about. Sex was not just risky because of things like, diseases and stuff. If you were out, fooling around with people you shouldn't be fooling around with. But I mean, it was a real risk that a woman would die. It was, and then the heartbreak of losing a child. Very, very difficult. I mean, it would be hard to, if you had lost a child or if you almost lost your life, to say, yeah, I'm just going to act as though this is not a big deal. It can really have a crushing impact on your intimacy. I can only imagine. We don't really consider that now, but take a moment and think about that. We don't have to worry about that as much, but our ancestors certainly did. And so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to open up our online discussion on our Blackboard. I've got a couple 3 threads in there that I'd like for you to contribute to. We're going to be placing some of Charlotte Temple into context, and I'd like you to contribute to the discussion as I described there on Blackboard. I'll give you the instructions on Blackboard, no later than Sunday at midnight, if you would. And a couple of little caveats here. I want you to focus really more on dialogue with one another than debate. It's okay. I like debate. That's fine. You can disagree. That's okay. But it's really kind of not our main job right now. We're not really there to debate and all that kind of stuff. We're there really to kind of exchange ideas. And this is another really important thing. I'm going to have a thread on there, at least one, that's going to ask you to find some things in the text that you thought were interesting. Share your ideas, share your sort of theories about it. There's nothing wrong with saying, you know what, I read this and we didn't talk about this in class, but first thing that came to mind was X, right? Now, here's the thing. I don't really want you just to offer sort of a thumbs up, thumbs down assessment of things. I really want you to tell me or tell your peers why you thought what you thought about the text, why you think things. I want you to give us your reasoning. Again, it's not necessarily a debate. It can be, but I want to see what made you come to that conclusion. Oh, I didn't like this character. Well, that's just a reaction. That's not an opinion. An opinion has reasons, okay? So I thought that this character was not very well developed because all we see about her is this, this, and this, and a well-developed character would have these traits. And I didn't see that. And so I think that's a major shortcoming of the novel. Ah, okay, that's a great opinion. Now we can talk about something, right? But, I didn't like Beauchamp, or I didn't like Belcourt. Isn't really much, there's nothing to go on. It doesn't prompt things. So I want to keep the ball rolling on it. Remember to try to contribute before Sunday night. And I'm probably going to, normally on these, I just kind of stay out of it. I just kind of watch, sit back and read. I don't chime in, but occasionally I'll chime in if somebody's got a big question and wants something clarified. I'm happy to do that, okay?